Next, environmental officials from 5 states testify on how they're dealing with the EPA's proposed greenhouse gas emissions rules for power plants. This Senate Environment and Public Works Committee hearing runs just under 2 hours.
Before we hit the gavel, let me give a clarification of this, of our Senate Armed Services Committee system that I wanted to adopt, and it has not been embraced by everyone, but we're going to be using it. That is, when we hit the gavel, whoever is here, we will go by the early bird, we'll go by seniority. Then those who come in after the gavel, we'll go get to them after everyone was already taken care of. So with that, I'll make note of who is here, if you do that. And we'll bring this meeting to order. It's great to have the panel. I had a chance to meet each one of you, and I really do think that the most important thing when we get into these rules and regulations is the state perspective, because they're the ones who have to carry these things out, have to pay for all this stuff. So we're here today with state officials, and on the CO2 regulations for existing power plants, not the new ones. The Clean Power Plan is unprecedented in scope, complexity, and requirements it will impose on state governments. That's what you guys are going to have to carry out. Yeah. The proposal undermines the longstanding concept of cooperative federalism under the Clean Air Act, where the federal government is meant to work in partnership with the states to achieve the underlying goals. Instead, the rule forces states to redesign the ways they generate, manage, and use electricity in a manner that satisfies President Obama's extreme climate agenda. Now, to date, we have 32 states who have opposed this rule. Put that, you got that chart up? There's the chart. There's 32 states that oppose the rule. 12 states, including my state of Oklahoma, are suing the agency over a lack of authority to promulgate the proposals. 9 states have passed resolutions in their legislatures that express limits to the proposal's application. 5 states have passed laws that would limit the proposal's application. Had the EPA engaged in a meaningful dialogue with all these states, the agency would not be rushing ahead to impose such an unfair and unworkable and likely illegal regulation. While the EPA is busy selling this as a plan to save the world from global warming, we know that this rule will have minuscule impacts on the environment. In fact, last week during the EPA budget hearing, Administrator McCarthy admitted that the agency has yet to do any modeling that would measure the proposal's impacts on temperatures and sea level rise. There's a reason for that, and the reason for that is that NERA, which is a very highly respected group on economic modeling and analysis, used the EPA's models and numbers and found that after spending $479 billion over a 15-year period, we would see the double-digit electricity prices increase in 43 states, reduce grid reliability resulting in voltage collapse and cascading outages. However, the Clean Power Plan would reduce CO2 concentrations by less than 0.5%. Global average temperatures rise would be reduced by only 0.01 degrees Fahrenheit, and sea level rise would be reduced by 0.3 millimeters, which is the thickness of 3 sheets of paper. Further, any perceived benefits will be rendered pointless by the continued emissions growth in India and in China. You hold that up a little higher so we can see it. That's a good chart there. And you can see the problems, and this is the whole point that Administrator Jackson was talking about. You know, what we do unilaterally here in the United States isn't going to have that much effect because it doesn't affect other countries. These results, or lack thereof, show that this rule is not about protecting the environment or saving lives of the local citizenry. This proposal is about expanding the government's control into every aspect of American lives. As MIT climate scientist Richard Lindzen, and Richard Lindzen's noted to be one of the foremost climatologists in the country, he said, Controlling carbon is a bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. EPA's rushed timeline, impractical assumptions, and arbitrary mandates pay no mind to the fact that this will be damaging to state economies and local residents. Their proposals are nothing more than a blatant and selfish power grab. We have been through these arguments multiple times before, most recently when the President failed to garner enough support for cap and trade under the Democrat-controlled House and Senate. We're talking about back when Nancy Pelosi was a majority, and so they had the White House and the House and the Senate. They couldn't get a majority vote in order to support this. So I appreciate very much all of the people coming so we can hear the voices from the states, and it's nice of you to take the time to be here. Senator Boxer.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome all of our witnesses. I'm very proud that Mary Nichols is here. She is really a legend in our state and has worked on the environment for her whole adult life. And she now is Executive Director of the California Air Resources Board. She's going to describe the successes that we're having. I'm also proud that my home state of California has been a leader in this field, and here's the deal. We're prospering. We have to reduce carbon pollution in order to address dangerous climate change, and we can't wait any longer because we're seeing the impacts all around us. According to NASA, the 10 warmest years on record occurred since the year 2000, and 2014 was the warmest year on record. Now, people can put their head in the stands, but that's the fact, and facts are stubborn things. According to a new peer-reviewed research in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and I trust my colleagues respect the National Academy of Sciences, California's record temperatures are driving the state's extreme drought, and scientists predict it will get worse over the coming decades. And just 2 weeks ago, scientists at NASA and at Cornell and Columbia found if we fail to act aggressively to cut carbon pollution, we have an 80% chance of a mega drought in the entire West. In the face of all this peer-reviewed science showing the impacts from uncontrolled dangerous carbon pollution, states really should be working together to find solutions to prevent climate change. And let me say, we know the American people want action. This isn't a guess, this is a poll. In a Stanford poll, 83% of Americans, including 61% of Republicans, say if nothing is done to reduce emissions, global warming will be a serious problem in the future. So again, you can sit here and say it's not an issue, but the American people are in disagreement with that conclusion. Ultimately, climate change deniers in the Senate continue to attack the landmark Clean Air Act. Just last week, our Majority Leader, Senator McConnell, told state governments to ignore the Clean Air Act. Imagine, ignore the law of the land, and one of the most popular legislative actions in our history. So we know we can reduce carbon while growing the economy, and I want to talk about California here and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, where New York is prospering as well, and we'll hear some of that from our witness. California is on a path to cut its carbon pollution by 80% by 2050, as required under our greenhouse gas emissions law in our state, AB 32, and the people who tried to overturn that lost at the ballot. During the first year and a half of the state's cap and trade program, California added 491,000 jobs, a growth of almost 3.3%, which outpaces the national growth rate of 2.5%. We are living proof that growing the economy and a safe environment go hand in hand. And we are a very large state. This has benefited the middle class. It may interest you to know that the Energy Information Administration found last month that California's monthly residential electric bill averaged $90 compared to Oklahoma's monthly bill, which averaged $110. Under California's climate program, many consumers are even receiving a twice-a-year climate credit of $35. That further lowers their utility bill. So California, New York, and other states around the country should be proud of their leadership in putting forward real solutions to climate change and showing that meeting the goals of the Clean Power Plan will benefit our states and our people. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Boxer. We're going to have some introductions by their request of some of our members of the panel. Let's start with Senator Barrasso.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and it gives me great pleasure to bring greetings from the committee to one of our those witnesses this morning, which is Todd Parfit, who is the director of the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. He has a long history working in the state of Wyoming and specifically working in this department. You'll remember, Mr. Chairman, that our former Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality Director, John Cora, spoke here, testified a number of years ago. Todd has worked closely with him and has succeeded him as now our director. It's interesting, Mr. Chairman, because today, as Todd testifies, he will have worked with a Democrat governor and a Republican governor in Wyoming, and has always put Wyoming first, has done what's best for our state and our environment. So it's a privilege today for me to introduce one of those testifying, Director of the Department of Environmental Quality for Wyoming, Todd Parfit. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. Anyone else here for introductory purposes? I don't believe they are. We're going to go ahead and start with our testimony. We'd like to ask you to do your best to conform your time to the time we required. We'll start with you, Mr. Myers, and then we'll work to the end to Ellen Nowak. You're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Boxer, and members of the committee for inviting me today to testify. I'm Michael Myers from the New York Attorney General's Office. My perspective is slightly different from those of other members of the panel. As an environmental lawyer, I've worked for the past 15 years at the Attorney General's Office counseling state regulators on legal issues related to air pollution and climate change, and also litigating those issues in the courts. It's particularly appropriate the committee should seek to hear state perspectives because under the provision of the Clean Air Act that EPA is using for the Clean Power Plan, Section 111D, states are in the driver's seat. But for us to succeed in this critically important area, each state has to be willing to take the wheel. From the perspective of a state, New York, that has already taken action to cut power plant greenhouse gas emissions, I have good news for other states. You can significantly reduce these emissions from the power sector and do so in a way that helps grow your economy. New York and other states in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative have reduced greenhouse gases from the electricity sector in our region by 40% from 2005 levels. And reinvesting the proceeds from the auction of pollution allowances in renewable and energy efficiency projects has kept down electricity costs in our region. EPA's Clean Power Plan would build off the work that the RGGI states and others like California have done in this area. The plan would cut greenhouse gases from power plants by about 730 million metric tons, equivalent to the annual emissions of powering half the homes in America. The shift to cleaner generation would also result in substantial public health benefits, including 150,000 fewer asthma attacks by 2030. But back to the point I started with. For this plan to work, states have to be willing to step up. Some are discouraging states from doing so on the grounds that the Clean Power Plan is unlawful. My written testimony highlights why such arguments are meritless. First, action under Section 111D to address greenhouse gases from fossil-fueled power plants is required under the Clean Air Act. The law requires EPA to ensure that states achieve emission reductions from power plants necessary to protect human health and welfare from the harms of carbon pollution. Second, EPA's regulation of hazardous air pollutants from existing power plants under one provision of the Clean Air Act does not preclude the use of Section 111D to require those plants to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. The implication of that claim is that EPA had a choice. It could either use the Act's hazardous air pollution program to cut power plant mercury emissions that poison the fish we eat, or it could combat climate change by using the provision the Supreme Court said speaks directly to power plant carbon emissions. Not only does this interpretation defy common sense, it's wrong as a matter of law. Third, it is clear that EPA has the authority to set substantive emission limitations for states to meet. In the absence of such a benchmark, state plans could vary widely in terms of their stringency and effectiveness. States have a lot of flexibility, however, on how to achieve their emission targets in a way that best suits their respective circumstances. Fourth, it's also clear that EPA has the authority to interpret the best system of emission reduction to reflect the various ways in which states and utilities have reduced greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector. EPA's building blocks approach appropriately recognizes successful strategies such as cap and invest programs, renewable portfolio standards, and energy efficiency that states and utilities have already shown can significantly reduce carbon emissions and do so cost effectively. In conclusion, here's what I'd urge state regulators to consider. The world scientists are telling us that we need to act now if we're to have a chance of avoiding catastrophic harms from climate change. Our faith leaders are telling us we have a moral imperative to act. The law, the Clean Air Act, requires us to act, and EPA's plan for cutting greenhouse gases from existing power plants is on sound legal ground. Both EPA and your fellow states are open to working with you on how best to cut emissions in your state. The time is now for state leadership, so take the wheel. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering the committee's questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Myers. Mary Nichols is the chairman of the California Air Resources Board. You're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Boxer, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I am Mary Nichols, chair of the California Air Resources Board, and I'm honored to be here to support EPA's proposed Clean Power Plan, which we believe will unlock state innovation across the country to protect our people and grow our economies. The framework proposed by EPA is a workable, practical plan that will cut carbon pollution along with other forms of pollution with a focus on increasing energy efficiency and the use of cleaner domestic energy sources. It provides an opportunity for a better future. This is the future that we are already working to create in California. Our success story has been one of bipartisanship. The 2006 California Global Warming Solutions Act was signed by our Republican former Governor Schwarzenegger, who appointed me to this position, and our Democratic Governor Jerry Brown, who has reappointed me and also, more importantly, has placed climate change at the core of his agenda, championing our enormously successful carbon market, ramping up green energy programs, and working nationally and internationally to spread solutions that will protect our vulnerable citizens, our extremely valuable agricultural industry, our coastline, and our forests against the already growing reality of climate change. Californians overwhelmingly support our board's efforts to move California towards cleaner and more efficient sources of energy and to address the grave threat that global warming poses to America and to the world. I'm here today to share some of our successes with you and to emphasize that EPA is using its Clean Air Act authority in the way that it was meant to spread success across the country and to encourage each state to develop its own plan to cut carbon pollution and to grow its economy. And I'm going to skip some of what's in the prepared testimony because I really want to focus on the fact that we believe that working together, not just as an environmental agency, but under the direction of our governor, with the Public Utilities Commission and our Energy Commission, as well as the independent system operator that controls the transmission wires, we can deliver not only a more resilient energy system, but we can also meet and even exceed the targets that EPA has set. We're on track for a third of our state's energy needs to be met by renewable energy by the year 2020, and Governor Brown has established a goal of getting to 50% of our energy from renewable resources by 2030. our carbon-wide carbon intensity has already fallen by nearly 5% since 2009, and it will keep falling. Now, that's not only due to electrical power plants, it's also due to cleaner fuels and cleaner vehicles, which are an integral part of our plan. The power plan, the EPA power plan, is only one piece of the overall President's climate plan, but it is an important one. But the main thing I want to emphasize is that this is happening at the same time that California is prospering. We're growing jobs, we're growing our economy faster than the rest of the country. We have grown our jobs since the carbon market has gone into operation by 3.3%. Personal income and wages are up, again growing at rates well above the national average. Our electric power grid delivers power reliably, resiliently, and efficiently, thanks to the continued stewardship of the transmission operators. And as Senator Boxer indicated, power bills are actually down. Californians pay the 9th lowest electricity bills in the country. States all across the country, and we do talk to many of our colleagues, are discovering that clean energy pays big dividends. For example, Oklahoma is on track to exceed its 15% renewable energy target for 2015, thanks to a very successful wind energy industry, a policy that has yielded billions of dollars in investment in that state and helped to cut pollution. And of course, California and Oklahoma are not alone. We know that Texas, often billed as our rival in many ways, leads the nation in wind industry. And many states in the Midwest, as well as the West and the South, are taking action to ensure their ratepayers and their citizens against risks to reliability that come from dirty and inefficient coal plants by replacing them with cleaner power. And energy efficiency investments are being used, again, in states red and blue to cut power bills. We think that the Clean Power Plan will encourage states to take broader advantage of strategies that they're already using, saving money and invigorating economies across the country. And of course, to the extent that they choose to work together around their regional grids, they will do even better, because we all know that a regional approach will be more cost-effective for all. As a result, we believe the net benefits of this plan amount to something like $48 to $82 billion in 2030, representing lives saved, 6 days avoided, and climate risks abated, as well as greater productivity, lower costs, and a more efficient and secure energy system. So bottom line is, Clean Power Plan builds on 40 years of Clean Air Act success, federalism, as the chairman indicated, and it now confronts us with an opportunity to address one of the most severe challenges of our time in a way that can also create new jobs and increase our energy security. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Nichols. Thomas Easterly is Commissioner of the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. You're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Boxer, and members of the committee. Good morning. My name is Thomas Easterly, and I am the Commissioner of the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, also known as IDEM. I bring you greetings from Governor Pence of Indiana, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with you Indiana's current perspective on the Environmental Protection Agency's proposed 111D regulations for fossil-fueled electric generating units. The proposed regulations will detrimentally impact Indiana for a number of significant reasons. We are the most manufacturing-intensive state in the United States. More than 80% of Indiana's electricity comes from coal. We have a 300-year supply of coal in our state, and 28,000 Hoosiers are employed in the coal industry. We recognize that we need all forms of energy to power our economy, and the Pence administration is developing an updated energy plan for the state that will continue to foster greater use of renewables and other energy sources. At the same time, we know that coal is a crucial Hoosier energy resource that must continue to be utilized. IDEM's mission is to protect Hoosiers and our environment. Following the release of the proposed rule, my office carefully examined the proposal in light of our mission. We also engaged private sector stakeholders and other state agencies in an extensive review of the proposal and its potential impacts. Our analysis came to only one conclusion: This proposal will cause significant harm to Hoosiers and most residents of the United States without providing any measurable offsetting benefits. For those reasons, Indiana's Office of Energy Development, Office of Utility Consumer Counselor, Department of Natural Resources, Utility Regulatory Commission, and my agency filed joint comments urging the U.S. EPA to withdraw this proposal. A copy of the joint comments and a letter from Governor Pence that accompany the joint comments has been shared with the committee. The most ironic impact of the proposed regulations is that they are likely to increase worldwide greenhouse gas emissions by decreasing the international competitiveness of U.S. businesses due to increased energy costs. Competitive businesses have been investing in cost-effective energy savings activities for decades. Under this proposal, the total cost of the products produced in the United States will need to increase, eroding our international competitiveness and resulting in the loss of manufacturing jobs in Indiana and across the nation. Well, when these businesses close, U.S. emissions will decrease, but worldwide greenhouse gas emissions will increase as our businesses move to areas with less efficient and more carbon-intensive energy supplies. Indiana once held a competitive advantage due to our low cost of electricity, but not anymore. Indiana's low cost of electricity advantage has slipped, and EPA regulations have significantly contributed to that change in position. The State Utility Forecasting Group in Indiana has forecasted a 30% increase in Indiana electrical costs, in part from U.S. EPA regulations already in place, and the 111D proposal will add additional costs on top of that 30%. U.S. EPA itself predicts that its 111D proposal will increase the cost of natural gas and the cost per kilowatt hour of residential electricity by about 10% in the next 6 years. Furthermore, increases in energy costs hit the poor, elderly, and most vulnerable in our society first. At a time when Indiana is doing all that it can to grow its economy and create jobs, the EPA's proposal creates a very real possibility that the increased energy costs will slow our economic progress and raise people's utility bills. In Indiana, we are obviously concerned about the economic impact of EPA's proposed rules on business and consumers, but we have also filed 31 pages of technical comments. We want to make sure the rule does not result in unintended consequences such as reduced reliability resulting in brownouts, or not yet having all of the necessary infrastructure in place to convert from coal to natural gas. For purposes of due diligence, Indiana is evaluating all available responses to the proposed regulations, from submitting a state plan to participating in a regional approach, or simply refusing to comply at all, known as a just say no option. However, the fact that this misguided policy will harm Hoosiers and other people in our country while actually increasing the worldwide level of the very emissions it is designed to increase compels Indiana to oppose the proposed regulations. Thank you for the opportunity to share our views and welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Easterly. Todd Parfit is the Director of the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, and you're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Boxer, and members of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. My name is Todd Parfit. I am the Director of the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. I thank the committee for inviting the state of Wyoming to share its perspective on the Clean Power Plan. The state of Wyoming has provided extensive comments to the Environmental Protection Agency on its proposed rule. In Wyoming, we take great pride in how we manage our natural resources, providing for both environmental stewardship and energy production. As our governor, Matt Mead, has stated, it is a false question to ask, do we want energy production or environmental stewardship? In Wyoming, we must and do have both. Wyoming sends electricity to both the eastern and western power grids, reaching from Iowa to Washington. Wyoming generated 49.6 million megawatt hours of electricity in 2012, with 66% of this electricity consumed beyond our borders. This electricity generation includes 88% coal and 9% wind. EPA's proposal impacts states differently. Each state has unique characteristics in energy portfolios that drive the application of each of the 4 building blocks. For Wyoming, the proposed goal is problematic and unrealistic to achieve. EPA is proposing a compressed timeline in which states are to develop and submit their state plans. Considering the complexities of the proposal and developing a compliance plan, along with any needed state legislation, the timelines are problematic if not unrealistic. Wyoming's emission reduction required by 2020, which is 70% of the proposed state goal, is far greater than can be achieved through heat rate improvements alone. This disparity is often referred to as the cliff. Wyoming's evaluation identified either data errors or incorrect assumptions in all 4 building blocks. I'll focus on key concerns with Block 3, renewable energy, since it has the largest impact on Wyoming's proposed goal. 100% of CO2 emissions from fossil fuel power plants, regardless of end user, will be attributed to the energy producing state. 66% of electricity generated in Wyoming is consumed outside its borders. According to EPA, renewable energy credits will be attributed to the consuming state, not the producing state. 85% of 4.3 million megawatt hours of wind energy generated in Wyoming is consumed outside its borders. Yet, when EPA calculated Wyoming's state goal, they applied a 6% escalation factor to all 4.3 million megawatt hours generated in Wyoming. More than half of the land in Wyoming is owned and managed by the federal government, subjecting many renewable transmission projects to NEPA. While the intent is good, the process is slow. A BLM high-priority wind project took over 4 years for a NEPA decision. Now the Fish and Wildlife Service requires an additional NEPA decision. 2 federal fast-track transmission projects in Wyoming are in their 8th year of the NEPA process. Both are still awaiting a final decision. Finally, EPA's assessment of available land in Wyoming for wind energy development failed to consider high-priority environmental conflicts such as greater sage-grouse habitat, other designated critical habitats, and protected areas of cultural and historical significance. Factoring in these considerations reduces available lands for renewables as proposed by 83%. All of these factors lead to an unrealistic goal for Wyoming. Now, directing your attention to the 2 graphs. Graph 1 depicts as a bar graph Wyoming's glide path as proposed by EPA.
Which one is 1?
Graph 1 is on your right.
Thank you.
Graph 1 depicts a bar graph of Wyoming's glide path as proposed by EPA. One can observe the dominant influence of the renewables component as shown in green. After review, Wyoming determined what is practically achievable given EPA's proposed avenues. This is shown in Graph 2. The line in the graph represents Wyoming's carbon emission requirements according to EPA's analysis. The colored bars were derived through extensive analysis by the state representing what may be possible in Wyoming. As can be seen, there is a wide gap between EPA's and Wyoming's analysis. Based on the proposed goal and with limited options, the simplest illustration to show an avenue for Wyoming to meet the initial 2020 goal is to consider how many coal-fired power plants must be closed. This would result in 4 plants closing, representing nearly 4,200 megawatts of the state's total coal fleet of over 6,700 megawatts. Stranded investment for these 4 would be nearly $1.5 billion and does not include the cost of replacement power. We look forward to continued dialogue with EPA and the other states as EPA considers our comments and reconsiders their proposal. Thank you for allowing me to provide input to your committee.
Thank you, Mr. Parfit. Ellen Nowak is the Commissioner, Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. You're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Boxer, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the state of Wisconsin and provide you with a summary of our state's assessment and concerns with the EPA's Clean Power Plan. My name is Ellen Nowak. I am the chairperson for the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. Last fall, I was intimately involved with the construction of the comments that the state of Wisconsin submitted to the EPA, and I submitted those comments together with our analysis with my written testimony for the record. Wisconsin is a manufacturing-heavy state, with industrial customers representing over 1/3 of energy sales, and more than 60% of our state's power generation comes from coal. If the problems in the Clean Power Plan are not remedied, the work Wisconsin has done to restore our manufacturing sector will be threatened. As a regulator, I also remain concerned about the reliability of the grid, considering the dramatic, fast shift in energy production required by this proposal. With that background, and because of the far-reaching impacts of the EPA's Clean Power Plan, we brought together an interdisciplinary team. This team consisted of Public Service Commission experts in utility rate modeling, economics, environmental regulation, and engineering, along with Department of Natural Resource experts in environmental regulation, particularly the Clean Air Act. Using a standard accepted utility modeling program, we forecasted the cost of this regulation under a number of scenarios with varying assumptions about the future. Candidly, our team felt that taking into account the impacts of this regulation on every family and every business in the United States is the kind of analysis that should have been done by the EPA before making such a proposal. The results of our analysis have been provided to the committee. Here are two highlights. First, this single federal regulation will cost Wisconsin ratepayers between $3.1 billion and $13.4 billion. This is only a production cost increase. It does not include necessary upgrades to the gas and electric transmission infrastructure that will add significantly to the cost of compliance. These costs are also on top of the $11.6 billion in carbon dioxide reduction measures that Wisconsin ratepayers have paid for since 2000. Not only do we not receive credit for these investments under the Clean Power Plan, but the proposal actually penalizes Wisconsin for being an early actor. Second, as our assumptions about this rule became more realistic, the cost rose. For instance, would you assume that this massive increase in reliance on natural gas would drive natural gas prices higher? That very reasonable assumption significantly raises the cost of this regulation. At the heart of the matter, we question the very foundation of this proposal. The EPA constructed 4 building blocks, each of which was evaluated independently. Then, to determine the foundation for each state's target reduction, the best system of emission reduction, or BSER, they added the carbon dioxide reductions resulting from each of those individual building blocks. Unfortunately, the EPA ignored how the building blocks would affect each other when all 4 were implemented together. For example, increasing reliance on natural gas, as suggested by Building Block 2, would severely decrease the heat rate improvement achievable in the coal fleet to far below the 6% required under Building Block 1. Furthermore, EPA used indiscriminate and unsupportable approaches to determine the 4 building blocks. For example, Building Block 1 applies a national level heat rate improvement to each coal-fired plant, regardless of the ability of an individual plant to realize these gains. In contrast, Building Block 3, the state renewable goals, takes a regional approach and is driven by the average renewable portfolio standards found in states arbitrarily grouped together. As it is currently written, under any previous interpretation of the Clean Air Act, the BSER system proposed by the EPA is actually not a system at all. First, the building blocks are outside of the coordination and control of the emission unit owner or operator. Second, they are not recognizable systems of work or practice or control that can be applied to an emission unit. And third, they cannot guarantee a certain conclusive greenhouse gas emission reduction when implemented as a whole. To further highlight this point, engineers at the Public Service Commission modeled the EPA plan and concluded the building blocks would deliver a 15.6% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. This is a far cry from the 34% that the EPA claims is attainable and necessary for Wisconsin to comply. Finally, the compliance timelines in the proposal are unrealistic and unworkable. The lead time required for planning, permitting, and construction, not to mention the EPA's own requirements, will require the full proposed compliance period through the end of 2030. In conclusion, I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to speak to this esteemed committee today. You will find my submitted written testimony delves much deeper into the issues of modeling and the technical aspects of the rule that we find troubling. We can all agree on the need to protect our environment, but this proposed rule does not strike the right balance in protecting public health, reliability of the grid, and economic security. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Nowak. In fact, the end of your remarks answered the first question I was going to ask you, the problem that if you submitted a SIP in compliance with Building Block 1, and yet they came along and say, no, we have to have a FIP, a federal program for 2, 3, and 4, would that create a problem? And I think you adequately answered that. But very similarly, I'd like to ask you that North Carolina proposed to delay the Clean Power Plan until a final ruling by the courts on the plan's many legal uncertainties. If you'll remember, during our budget hearing, the administrator of the EPA talked about, I think it was $3.5 million to hire a bunch of new attorneys because of all the lawsuits and problems. And I would ask you, in the state of Wisconsin, you could end up taking steps to comply with the Clean Power Plan that the state came back and found that it was ultimately out of compliance. So what kind of problem would that be for Wisconsin?
It creates a lot of uncertainty. As a regulator, the parties we regulate and ratepayers all want and deserve certainty about where rates are going to go and what we may do. You know, when we become commissioners, they don't give us crystal balls. So unfortunately, we can't look into the future, but we have to make the best decision based on the information before us. We ran into a similar issue with the cross-state air pollution rule when it was hung up in the courts and utilities were starting to make movements to attempt to comply. And we have to do the best to allow them to try to recover, but we have to be judicious, obviously, in spending ratepayer dollars. So we'll work closely and obviously monitor the legal proceedings and any legal proceedings that Wisconsin is involved in, so we don't unnecessarily spend ratepayer dollars.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Easterly, in your written testimony, you talked a little bit, elaborated a little bit more on how the Clean Power Plan proposal could actually increase the cost and this increase the amount of emissions. And this is a position that I've held ever since Lisa Jackson said that no, doing something unilaterally in the United States is not going to affect it, because this isn't where the problems are, as you saw in this chart with China. Did you want to elaborate any more on that concept about it could increase instead of decrease emissions?
Most of our businesses, the basic bottom of our economy, the steel industry, the auto industry, rely on energy costs, and they're internationally competitive. So you can buy steel from Brazil, you can buy steel from India, you can buy steel from Russia and use it. And actually, why would you bother to bring the steel to the United States? You just bring the finished product here. So the emissions will happen in those countries. Some of those countries have decided to, like I understand that China signed an agreement to consider stopping the growth of their emissions by about 2030. But between now and 2030, those emissions, they're still much higher per unit of production than we have here. So as our businesses have to stay in business by being internationally competitive, I'm very concerned that total emissions will go up.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Ms. Nowak, have you done an analysis as to how much of a rate increase would the PSC have to approve to implement this plan?
We expect it to be in the double digits, depending on which method of compliance we use. It could be easily into the upper 20% of an increase. Right now, we have more of an aggregate number, the $3 to $13 billion for the state to comply. How that is eventually broken down on a per ratepayer increase is something that will be flushed out as we further, know more details and utilities come in and ask for recovery. But this is going to be a significant increase on ratepayers all across the board, low income to our large manufacturers.
All right, well, thank you. And I'm going to be either asking you for the record, Mr. Myers, or if there's time at the end of toward the end of my 6 minutes, if you would agree with the position that many have taken, that wouldn't it be better to wait until these controversial legal issues are cleared up before requiring them to comply? I hope we have time because I do want to hear your answer to that. So I'd say to Ms. Noack, Mr. Easterly, and Mr. Parfit, what parts of the Clean Power Plan will require enactment of new laws in your state, and how long would it take to develop, pass, and implement these laws? Let's go ahead and start with you, Mr. Parfit. You hadn't been asked yet.
Mr. Chairman, as far as legislation that may need to be put into place, anything that would relate to a multi-state plan, if there were to be one developed, would certainly need some legislative discussion. Anything dealing with a renewable portfolio standard, basically the building blocks 3 and 4, would likely require some sort of legislation. Now, the timing of that is our legislature meets for a 40-day session and then a 20-day session, so alternating. So our next session coming up is a budget session. So there's some timing concerns related to when something could be brought forth to the legislature in a meaningful way through an interim topic study as well.
All right, that's right. Mr. Easterly?
So in Indiana, our legislature also doesn't meet year-round. So the next time they could consider things are 2016. We don't have authority for building blocks 2, 3, and 4. And then if I have to pass rules, we have an 18-month rulemaking process. Yeah. So we'll be years out.
Yeah. Any further comment?
We have at least a 3-year rulemaking process on a controversial rule, which I would submit this would be one. And we would also have to change, we don't have authority over building blocks 3 and 4. If we were to increase our RPS or change our energy efficiency standards, those would all require legislative action as well, which adds to the timelines.
Thank you. Senator Boxer.
Thank you so much. What I'm stunned by is some of the states' attitude of gloom and doom when we have states that are doing this, prospering far more than your states. And that's what kind of stuns me. But it's okay. I respect your view. I want to ask Mary Nichols this question. When you listen to Mr. Easterly respond to my chairman in where they said, well, actually, these rules could mean that we'd be increasing carbon worldwide because some companies will leave the states. They'll be so upset at these rules. Have we found companies running away from California? Last I checked, Silicon Valley was booming. We have increases in manufacturing. Am I wrong on the point?
You're not wrong, Senator Boxer. We have experienced growth across the board, but particularly in the clean energy sector in California because of our policies. We are the leading state in terms of investment in clean technology and also in renewable energy in the country right now. Solar energy in particular is booming. Obviously, we have some natural advantages in California in terms of renewables. And I think it is important to say that there needs to be transition time for all industries and all states. When we implemented our cap on carbon emissions with a trading program, there were many who were concerned about the rising cost of electricity to our manufacturing sector. It's a critical concern for everybody, along with reliability. No state, no governor can afford to take risks with the lights going out in their state. That is job one, no matter how much we care about the environment or greenhouse gases, and we do profoundly, we know that our job is also to make sure that the lights stay on. So I think it's important to recognize that this proposal that EPA has put out does have within it the flexibility and the time that's needed. I recognize the concerns of my fellow states, and I think they're legitimate concerns, but I would assert that the proposal as EPA has put it out, which admittedly they will be modifying as they go forward, can address those concerns.
I think that's such an important point because you make it very clear that we need a transition time, and we start a little earlier. And I think EPA does get that. Gina McCarthy does get that. She's very sensitive to the states. Mr. Myers, I wanted to ask you, last year, former EPA Administrator Christy Todd Whitman, who served under George W. Bush, testified before our Clean Air Subcommittee that it was settled law that the Clean Air Act can be used to control carbon pollution. Are EPA's proposed carbon standards supported by the 3 Supreme Court decisions in Massachusetts v. EPA 2007, American Electric Power v. Connecticut 2011, and Utility Air Regulatory Group versus EPA, June 23, 2014.
Yes, they are, Senator. The Massachusetts versus EPA cases, you may recall, recognize that EPA has the authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And the Connecticut versus American Electric Power case was a case that was New York was involved in, where we sought to get at the very same emissions that the EPA Clean Power Plan is going to get at. And the Supreme Court in that case told us that federal common law nuisance did not apply because Section 111 speaks directly to these power plant emissions. And with respect to the last decision, the UARG decision that you mentioned, the Supreme Court again reaffirmed EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, and there found that under the Act's stationary source permitting program, if you're emitting a certain amount of conventional pollutants, then you also have to apply the best available control technology for CO2 emissions. So I think all told, those decisions provide a sound foundation for EPA's Clean Power Plan.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. Mr. Parfit, last month, the Chief Environmental Counsel at Berkshire Hathaway Energy, which owns a dozen utilities across the country, including Rocky Mountain Power, a regulated utility serving Wyoming, stated about the state's compliance with the Clean Power Plan, and I quote, and I would like to get your reaction to that. If the state wants to push back against the plan, that's okay. But we really do have to have a backup plan, because if not, we'll be caught in a situation where we don't have any option, and that's the worst of all positions to be in. She also stated the Clean Power Plan's 2030 targets are achievable and urged Wyoming to collaborate with other states to meet them. Do you agree with Rocky Mountain Power that Wyoming would be best served by completing a state compliance plan?
I can't speak specifically to the comments of Rocky Mountain Power, but what I can say is that our evaluation, when we look at the entirety of the plan, it doesn't work for Wyoming, because as I showed in the charts that we displayed, is that the options and the building blocks that were as presented by EPA in the proposal don't work for Wyoming, and so we would say that no, the plan as stated, because we have more than one utility within the state.
I totally appreciate that. Last question. Have you told EPA your concerns, and have you given some options to the EPA? Because they really want to work with the states. Have you let them know how you feel, and specifically what's wrong with what they're doing for Wyoming?
Yes, we have provided comments from both the DEQ and Public Service Commission, and have had discussions since the comment period.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Boxer. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That's what I've got.
During the time that we were on the campaign trail this last year, and I'm new to the committee and new to the process up here, one of the items that we talked about a lot was the anticipated cost to the average American family with regard to an increase in their cost for electric rates. The United States Chamber of Commerce last summer, I believe, estimated that the average cost to the average American family would be approximately $1,400 more per year in their electric rates. I was curious, Mr. Parfit, in a recent statistic that comes in the case of my state, South Dakota, that our electric rates would increase probably about 20% or more as a result of the Clean Power Plan. This is significantly more than the 8.8 cents per kilowatt hour that South Dakotans pay now. According to the Wyoming Public Service Commission, compliance costs for the 111D proposal could well exceed $50 per ton of carbon. What impacts will this have not only on ratepayers in Wyoming, but also on ratepayers in surrounding states? I know that people in South Dakota receive power from Wyoming. Wyoming, as you indicated earlier, supplies power because of your location to the natural resources available. You've been an exporter of power. Could you share a little bit about what this will have to the rates for people in the other states as well?
Well, yeah, and we do provide power to many other states, and if our compliance path, as we've viewed it, based on the proposal, results in the premature closure of plants and the stranded assets, it would likely result in raising of rates for all the customers, not just those in Wyoming. That would be shared across the network.
Well, what does the EPA propose, or how does the EPA propose that you respond to those stranded costs? What's their expectation?
This is an issue that we had raised with EPA before the proposal was put out to notice, in hopes that would be taken into consideration. And in our view, that hasn't been taken into consideration, and we don't see, at least at this point, the off-ramp. And we've expressed this concern to EPA in our comments, and so we're waiting to see how they might respond in June when they come out with the final proposal.
So you have not had a comment back, or there is not a process in place within this to get a response back for the stranded costs that you've indicated your state would have and would have to pass on to other states that also expect the electricity, or the places where your organizations have contracts with to provide ongoing electrical power? Those stranded costs, you don't know how those would be handled?
At this point, EPA has not conveyed to us how they would address that particular comment. The conversations that we've had with EPA have been primarily to get clarification on some of the corrections that we pointed out within the proposal itself.
The EPA claims that the rules give states flexibility to create their own plans, but it appears that it overlooks the fact that electricity transmission does not stop at state borders. Many states, including South Dakota, depend on neighboring states to help support their own electricity generation and ensure the reliability of the grid. The EPA's modeling suggests that under the 111D proposal, Wyoming could cut its generation by 7.5 million megawatts, or million megawatt hours. How will Wyoming continue to power the regional, how will you continue to power the regional economy with cuts like this, and is that an accurate statement?
As far as how we would continue, if we're looking at closing down existing power plants, that would create a reliability issue. However, this is getting a little bit out of my expertise, would be within the expertise of the Public Service Commission in terms of how to maintain the reliability of service to all of its customers.
Thank you. Appreciate your time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Senator Carper.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. To each of you, welcome. Glad to see you. Thanks for the work you do, and thanks for presenting your thoughts with us and responding to our questions. My colleagues know I come before a lot of these issues, not as a sitting senator, but as a recovering governor. And I just want to share with you a little bit of the perspective from the little state of Delaware, and from a guy who was born in West Virginia, whose dad was once a coal miner for a little bit of time. So I come at a lot of different perspectives. When I was governor of Delaware, I could have shut down the economy of my state in order to try to be in compliance with clean air standards, and we would have been out of compliance. And the reason why is because the folks who were creating cheap electricity to the west of us simply put bad stuff up in the air, and it came our way. We were at the end of America's tailpipe. So was Maryland, so was Pennsylvania, so is New Jersey, so is New York. And I'm a big believer in the golden rule, treat other people the way I want to be treated. And the concerns that y'all are laying out here for us today, I think they're important concerns, and we've got to be mindful of them, okay? I get it. EPA needs to be mindful of them as well. But I just want you to know that there are other folks that have been adversely affected by your ability, or the ability of some people in our country to develop cheap electricity, dirty electricity, and we suffer the consequences. I don't like it. We haven't liked it. We tried to go to court to resolve that, and we finally have succeeded in doing that. The other thing I want you to know, I want you to get in a car with me. Just use your imagination. We're in southern Delaware. We're driving on Prime Hook Road to the east, to the Delaware Bay. We get to the Delaware Bay. There used to be a parking lot there, big parking lot there. It's not there anymore. Well, actually it is, it's underwater. And you look off to the right, you'll see a bunker sticking up out of the water, about 500 feet out. It used to be about 500 feet on the land. Now it's 500 feet out in the water. Something's going on here. We're going to just make this stuff up. And the key is, for us, is how can we have cleaner air? How can we address the issues of rising waters? Delaware's the lowest lying state in the country. This is a real problem for us. In order for us to address this, we need to figure out how to do it together. And I'm not interested in seeing EPA jam anything down your throats, but we need to figure out how to work on this together. One of the issues, Wyoming create a lot of electricity. Sounds like you export a lot of electricity. My understanding of the rules that are being contemplated here, you don't get a lot of credit for that. And the credit, I guess, goes to California and those other states. We ought to be able to figure out how to deal with that. We ought to be able to use some common sense and figure out how to deal with that, okay? I want to ask a question of, we got a lady from California. Sounds to me like your economy's doing pretty well. And the question is it possible to have a cleaner environment and a stronger economy? I think you've answered that. We think the answer is yes, you can have both. It's a false choice. I think most of you at this table would agree with that. There are a couple of things, and this is the folks from California. You're in a situation where you've acted early. You've been a good citizen, good steward, and my sense is you're going to be punished for it if we're not careful by EPA. We're in the same situation. We don't like that. What do you think we should do about it?
Well, I think your comment earlier about states needing to work together is exactly correct. To my friend from Wyoming, my local utility, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, just concluded a very large agreement with a Wyoming wind company to import wind-generated electricity from Wyoming to help replace some of the coal-fired energy that they have been relying on. They are actually taking responsibility for being the largest emitter in our state, even though the electricity that we were using was coming from Utah, as it happens, and there will be costs associated with transitioning away from the coal and into the wind. But overall, the net of it is that Los Angeles ratepayers will still be doing okay because the utility is taking steps to help their customers become more efficient in their use of energy. And that, I think, is kind of the critical ingredient here, that if our rates go up because of new investments that we're making, that has to be offset in some way in order to shield the ratepayers from rate shocks and from things that would just make it untenable for them to move forward on this cleaner electricity plan that we're on. But given some time for the transition, we can do it. I do think that it was right to come up with a crediting mechanism. I think EPA needs to do this if they want to encourage regional cooperation, as they say they do. They're going to have to allow states to work together on a either bilateral or regional basis to come up with programs where they can effectively share the cost and the benefits. That's what we're doing right now through our agreement with the Canadian province of Quebec, where we now run a literally bi-state, bi-national trading program with emissions allowances. Obviously, not everybody's going to want to go that far afield, but the concept, I think, is one that has been proven to work.
Okay, thanks. So very briefly, could each of you just give me what you think is a fair compromise, the issue of Wyoming generating all this electricity, clean electricity by wind, and shipping it off to California and other places, not really getting the credit for it, and it sounds like the credit, as I understand it, goes to California or the other states that are the customers. What's a fair way to deal with this? What's a fair compromise? Ms. Nowick, really briefly, quick.
A fair way, I didn't fully understand your questions.
Okay, Mr. Parfit, can you try to answer this? It certainly pertains to you. You must have thought about this.
Well, as it pertains to the Clean Power Plan, I think there's the two issues, or actually three issues here at play. And the first is the attribution of fossil fuel emissions CO2 emissions being attributed 100% to the energy-producing states. And the other issue that's at play here is the renewable energy that's generated in Wyoming, which most of it, 85% of that, is shipped out of state. Now, applying an escalator to that is 100% of that to the producing state is unfair and then creates that disadvantage.
So, you know what, Mr. Chairman, I'll say this. We got to figure out a good compromise here, and y'all have to help us. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Garber. Senator Capito.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the panel, thank the chairman and ranking member. Let me just say a few words about my home state of West Virginia and what we've had to say about the Clean Power Plan. You know, our own EPA has called it patently illegal, invading the province, and it has been put forward with the finesse of a bull in a china shop. We have joined, I would note in the comments that 32 states have submitted negative comments or comments of great concern to this rule, while the numbers that have submitted comments in support are much, much smaller in terms of states. But I want to talk about the reliability issue. West Virginia has joined with other states, probably several of yours, to block this plan, and we'll be hearing this suit in the next several months. The EPA in West Virginia has said, or the DEP in West Virginia has said that these goals are unattainable. And we've heard some testimony to that. With that in mind, I'd like to talk to Mr. Esterly, because we have a lot in common in terms of your production of your electricity predominantly with coal. We have 95% of our electricity is generated by coal for obvious reasons. We've got a lot of coal, although not as much as Wyoming. And so EPA has indicated that it does not have any significant concerns about reliability with this rule. But yet last week, PJM Interconnection released a new analysis that found that the Clean Power Plan could trigger up to 49 gigawatts of generating capacity in jeopardy. Let me just quantify 49 gigawatts is the equivalent of the electricity that's used to power 50 million homes. This is one of the studies that was recently released that I think calls into question the reliability issue. Are you concerned about reliability in Indiana? I would note that Ms. Nichols did mention the reliability issue as a very important one for the state of California, but I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Yes, we are. We have another group that deals with reliability, but here's our fundamental problem. The plan, even in EPA's best thought process, has significantly more fossil fuel fired reductions by closure than it does new generation of renewables and wind and other things. So the plan necessarily will reduce the flexibility of our electric supply in the United States. You add this to the fact that we've had record PJM demand days. They were a little better handled this year than they were last year under the polar vortex, and we're in PJM and MISO. So we have increasing demand, we have decreasing supply, and the renewable supply it's valuable, but it's not reliable. So sometimes the wind's blowing, sometimes it's not, sometimes the solar panels don't have clouds or snow on them, and sometimes they don't. So you can't count on them for either thing. Their nameplate capacity is much higher than their actual generation, and they're not always available when you need them. So I am very concerned, as are a lot of people in the industry, that we will see some catastrophic results sometime during the implementation of this plan. We just don't know where or when.
Ms. Nowak, do you have a comment on that reliability issue?
Certainly. We have some significant concerns from the perspective of system reliability. The modeling program used by the EPA to evaluate the building blocks and whether the goals are actually achievable uses less robust data than possessed and used by our own RTO, MISO. And they are responsible for maintaining our grid. Unfortunately, the EPA never asked MISO to do any studies of the grid prior to releasing this proposal. Examples of the work that we think needs to get done includes gathering information about firmness of the interstate pipeline deliverability for gas-fired units, plans for replacement of units, the impact on the increase of intermittent renewable resources on reliability, and considering the electrical grid location and network deliverability of units to be expected to be retired. Again, the modeling used by the EPA doesn't appear to consider any of these very fundamental and necessary factors, so we are concerned.
Yeah, I would note in my state, we are heavily reliant on coal for obvious reasons, but we also have a lot of natural gas. But to transition these older plants to natural gas is just not a realistic endeavor. It's exceedingly expensive, and to build new ones takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. You're going to expend energy to move forward on this as well. You've also just recently closed one of your nuclear plants in Wisconsin, and your plan that was put forward for you under this clean power plant does not take into consideration your loss of nuclear power. I mean, that's got to be a problem for you too in terms of meeting this challenge. Could you make a comment on that?
Sure. The loss of that plant is huge for Wisconsin, and we think that eventually that is going to have to be replaced with a carbon neutral source, and that was not taken into account for. That will increase to the cost of this proposal for Wisconsin to comply.
Ms. Nichols, let me ask you a quick question. We had a hearing last week on ozone and the new regulations that are going to be put into effect. Is every county in California compliant with the current ozone regulations that we have presently?
No, Senator, we're not. We have remaining challenges in both Southern California and in the Central Valley in meeting the ozone standards, and the new ozone standard will add an extra challenge as well as some extra time to that effort.
Right. So you put that on top of what we're doing here with the clean power, and that's
we care about the health of our citizens, Senator. Yes.
Well, I care about that as well.
Yes. Yes. We rely on the science.
In terms of how we're going to meet this challenge, in terms of our timelines, extension of timelines, extension of measures, what's going to be the best? I'll ask Mr. Parfit from Wyoming. What's going to be the easiest thing to knock down on this clean power plan that's going to make the biggest impact for you to be able to, meet the challenges? Deadlines, timelines, lower standards, less reductions?
Well, certainly timelines are a big component of this when you consider developing a plan and the time involved with that and the complexities in the amount of agencies and states that would have to be involved in that discussion, let alone the legislation and rules that we've already mentioned here, and the time that would take seem to be very problematic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And underlying this entire discussion is the challenge we have with carbon pollution, methane pollution, and the impact it's having across the world. But we don't have to look across the world. We can look to our home state my home state of Oregon. And indeed, we are seeing that the fire season has grown by 60 days over the last several decades. And the number of acres of forest that's been burned has increased dramatically. We have an oyster industry that's having great trouble because the baby oysters have trouble forming shells because the ocean's 30% more acidic than it was before the Industrial Revolution. We have a farming community that's suffering significant, repeated, worst ever droughts because the snowpack in the Cascades is steadily declining, and this year is one of the lowest ever. And while rain earlier in the year can fill a reservoir, if you don't have the snowpack come August, you're in trouble. So as we see this impact on farming and fishing and forestry right now, we're not talking 50 years in the future, 100 years in the future. We're seeing it right now, just like Delaware. Senator Carper was talking about land that's now underwater. Should the entities that are being damaged by carbon pollution be able to sue those who are generating the carbon proportional to their contribution? Mr. Easterly?
I'm not a lawyer, so I can't answer should somebody be able to sue. But remember that the environment of our Earth has been changing for all of recorded history. Indiana used to be under a huge ice sheet. There are natural variations, and the things you talked about, some scientists would say, are due to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and they're likely to continue causing harm
Thank you, Mr. Easterly.
in California for 20 years.
Parliament, would you like to answer? Parfit?
Oh, Mr.
And I would echo those comments that, this is a legal question that I'm not an attorney that can address that.
Okay, a legal question, but the principle you understand of polluter pays when you do some damage to your neighbor, shouldn't you bear some responsibility just as a basic fundamental principle?
And I think this is a complicated question.
Okay,
where
thank you.
You've got users that may have some responsibility as well. So from a legal standpoint,
Okay, you don't want to answer the question. That's fine, Ms. Nowak.
If the utilities and entities are following existing law and regulation, I would think it would be a very chilling effect to then have them subjected to legal claims.
Okay, well, everyone in their first year of economics learns about externalities, things that are not reflected in the market, damage done by activities. Certainly, our libertarian friends would say, when you do damage to your neighbor, you should compensate for that damage. Now, the fact is, carbon's produced and methane produced in a million different ways. There's no state that doesn't produce a lot of both. But we are seeing a differential in how states are taking this on. Oregon is now about 70% of its electricity is produced in non-fossil format. And Ms. Nichols, you were referring to a 2020 goal of 1/3, but that didn't include your hydropower, I don't believe. What is it with hydropower included?
If we included the hydro that we receive, we'd be already at above our 30%, 33% goal. So we chose not to add it, or the legislature chose not to add it, or nuclear, because they were trying to really push for new solar, wind, geothermal, and biomass energy.
Say what that percentage would be again if those things were included in other non-fossil?
Pardon me?
If you include the other non-fossil, then
we'd be about 40%.
40%.
Yeah.
Well, you got to aim for Oregon. We're at 70%, and we're shipping a lot of wind energy.
We envy Oregon.
And we often respect greatly the examples that you're setting. Particularly, you've set up a marketplace. Now, if we turn back in time, there was a proposal that came really from right-wing think tanks about using markets to regulate sulfur dioxide to take on acid rain. And the concept was not to regulate every smokestack, but to proceed to set up a marketplace and thereby the most cost-effective solutions would be adopted. How did that work out, or do you have a memory of that?
Well, Senator, I was the assistant administrator at EPA when we implemented the acid rain trading program, and I'm very proud of the success of that program. It did reach its goals in terms of the amount of sulfur dioxide that was reduced, and it did so less expensively. We relied on that plan in designing our cap and trade program in California.
So the marketplace for sulfur dioxide worked extraordinarily well, actually lower cost, and faster results than anyone anticipated. It was really off the charts of success, and congratulations. Why wouldn't that same strategy work well in carbon dioxide?
Well, we believe it would. It was, as you know, defeated here, but within California, it was actually put on the ballot, and the voters chose to keep that system in effect because I think they became convinced that it would lead us to a cleaner energy future.
They want to see carbon dioxide reduced in the most cost-effective manner to achieve similar off-the-chart positive results.
Yes, sir.
And isn't the Clean Power Plan really based around that same core principle of states developing their own plan through a range of different choices of how to address carbon? Not quite a cap and trade, but that is a possibility that a state could implement.
It's clearly allowable. It's not required. I know that EPA was very familiar with our program when they designed the rule, but I also understand that they tried really hard. It doesn't seem like they've quite succeeded just yet anyway, to indicate to states that they would have the ability to design a plan that fit their own unique situation.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. Senator Barrasso would be next, but he's graciously conceded to let Senator Bozeman go ahead of him.
Thank you very much. And again, just for a second, but I appreciate it. Ms. Nichols, following up on Senator Merkley's question, you're out of compliance for ozone. And the EPA's regulatory impact analysis says the annual cost of California alone would be $800 million to $2.2 billion per year. Do you feel like individuals should be able to sue you for noncompliance?
Under the Clean Air Act, citizens have the ability to sue EPA or indirectly the state for noncompliance with any element of a SIP. California has submitted a state implementation plan, and we are in compliance with our plan. We are moving forward steadily every year, bringing down our levels of ozone, and we've actually come into compliance in many counties.
So your argument then is the same as Ms. Nowak's, in the sense that if you're doing things, as required by law, then you shouldn't be sued.
One of the reasons why we're here to defend the carbon plan, the EPA plan, is that it helps us with our ozone standard as well. We need all the help we can get.
But in regard to the question, do you agree with Ms. Nowak in the sense that, if you're in compliance with what the regulation requires, you shouldn't be sued?
Mr. Bozen, I went to law school too, and we were taught that anybody can file a lawsuit.
I'm an optometrist, I'm an eye doctor, I didn't go to law school.
Anybody can file a lawsuit, and sometimes they can win.
I guess what I'm saying, what she's saying is that really would wreak havoc, in the sense there's no way that you're going to be, when do you feel like you're going to be ozone compliant?
At this point, we're projecting off into the future. We're working as hard as we can, but it'll probably be as challenging, if not more challenging, to meet the ozone standard as it is to meet the greenhouse gas standard. And that's exactly why we are supporting the EPA rule, because it will help us with both.
Do you agree it will cost you $800 million to $2.2 billion a year?
I can't verify that number. I would say, though, that the economic analysis that EPA did in advance was using all the tools that we would have used in the same way.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks very much to the panel for being here. Let me ask first Commissioner Nowak. In 2013, Commissioner Nowak, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel published an editorial in your home state that said, and I'll quote, "Climate change is happening. Human activity plays a huge role in that.
The answer is about 100 years.
The consequences of doing nothing could be dire and expensive." Do you agree with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel on that?
Thank you for the question. My role as a regulator, or an economic regulator, we ensure also the reliability of the grid. I did not, or do not endeavor to take on the policy behind what is before us. My role here has been analyzing it and rules that come before us. And I look for three things. If an environmental rule is coming, does it compromise the affordability, the safety and reliability of our grid? That's the lens that I look through this rule. I think
so no amount of environmental cost would figure into your analysis then?
No, that's not what I said.
That's exactly what you said. I'm just trying to make sure that I understood it properly and want you to explain further.
Environmental rules cannot unduly compromise the reliability, affordability.
No matter how great the environmental costs.
There is a balance that needs to be struck.
Now, how do you strike that balance if you don't know whether climate change is happening and whether human activity plays a huge role in that, and whether the consequences of doing nothing could be dire and expensive, which I assume dire and expensive are words that would fit into that calculus?
We look at what the impact on our ratepayers would be and the benefits to the environment under the proposed rule.
But the impact on your ratepayers could be felt through climate change, as well as through just the rates that they pay, could they not?
Those are...
And that's not a part of what you looked at. That's not part of your analysis.
The benefits have been put forth by the EPA in their plan, and we are weighing the costs against the benefits that the EPA has proposed.
For what it's worth, the executive director of the Wisconsin Business Alliance has called renewable energy an economic opportunity for Wisconsin that will, quote, result in business growth, job creation, cleaner air, and a quicker path to energy independence. She recently said, we should look for opportunities to promote jobs and the environment, and the Clean Power Plan is a great way to do that. So there appear to be other voices from Wisconsin. Mr. Parfit, Rocky Mountain Power's owner, the spokesperson for Rocky Mountain Power's owner, has said that multi-state approaches are likely to be a less costly way to meet the Clean Power Plan's targets. Wyoming's Casper Star Tribune has said that, and I'll quote them, Montana officials have held earlier discussions with other states about the prospect of cooperating to meet the EPA's targets, consistent with the multi-state approach that Rocky Mountain Power's owner referred to. Their Wyoming counterparts, the Wyoming Casper Star Tribune continued, have thus far rejected regional advances. Now, Montana, which is also a rural state that generates a significant portion of its electricity from coal, has come up with 5 draft options for complying with the proposed standards, including options that would not require Montana to shutter its coal plants. So if Montana can do this, why can't Wyoming? And if Montana will work with other states, why won't Wyoming?
Well, first I'll address Montana's 5 different alternatives. In their alternatives, they assume that they will get credit for 100% of the wind energy. And that's not what we've been conveyed, or what has been conveyed by EPA. We've been told that we would get no credit for wind energy that is consumed outside the state. So that's one difference. As far as the multi-state discussions, I will say that we have been involved with the same group, the Center for New Energy Environment, and participating in those conversations along with Montana and 13 other states. Now, there are challenges with a multi-state plan, particularly when we don't know what the end goal is going to be. All we have right now is what has been proposed. We don't know how EPA is going to change that proposal based on the comments that have been received. So we don't know what the targets are going to be.
Do you agree that climate change is happening, that human activity plays a huge role in it, and that the consequences of doing nothing could be dire and expensive?
You know, I'm here to talk about the Clean Power Plan and whether or not, if we're going to do something to address CO2 emissions, whether or not this is a good plan and is it workable for Wyoming, and the answer is it's not workable for Wyoming.
Irrespective of the amount of damage that CO2 might do. There's no number from CO2 harm that could cause you to change your point of view on that.
Well, my point of view, not on the proposed plan and what that does to
very well
plants.
Finally, Mr. Easterly, how have you built the costs of climate change for Indiana into your analysis of the value of the Clean Power Plan?
I don't think you can quantify any cost of future climate change on the state of Indiana. But let's go back to your other question. We need a plan.
Why do you not think you can quantify it? Isn't that part of your job?
There's nothing concrete to quantify.
Have you read the business report that says that 8 to 23% likely increase in energy costs could come to Indianapolis?
The energy costs are from the Clean Power Plan, yes.
No, this is not from the Clean Power Plan. This is from increased heat in Indiana, requiring increased cooling load during the... You didn't read that. You're not familiar with that report, obviously.
Not that one.
Okay.
There are many.
When you're talking about the cost of electricity, are you talking about it on a per kilowatt hour basis? Let me just say, if I could, I'm sorry to go over for a minute. Can I just make a Rhode Island point? It's very brief.
How long is the Rhode Island point?
Less than a minute. Less than a minute.
30 seconds.
Average monthly bills of residential customers in Wisconsin are $95.21. In Indiana, they're $110.44, and in Wyoming, they're $90.85. In Rhode Island, they're $91.48, lower than 2 of these states, even though our kilowatt-hour costs are higher because we've invested intelligently in energy efficiency, and it's that figure that really matters at the pocketbook.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Barrasso.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, to Ms. Nowak, it was affordability, reliability, and safety. Were those the 3 that you consider?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Parfit, just to kind of review, when it comes to how the EPA credits renewable energy, Wyoming, which produces a significant amount of renewable energy, still stands to be severely disadvantaged. You talked about how much Wyoming can produce in terms of wind energy. I think you said that 85% of Wyoming's wind energy is exported to a number of other states. I heard Chairman Nichols say that California wants to buy even more Wyoming wind energy. But the EPA has said, no, that renewable energy is going to only be credited to the state where it's consumed, not where the energy is created, the hosting state, which means that Wyoming gets absolutely no credit for most of the wind energy that it develops. So I appreciate Senator Carper saying that that needs to be addressed. So my question is, how is this going to impact Wyoming's ability to attain our emission target? And then how much additional renewable generation would we have to develop just to meet the EPA's proposed target?
Well, this makes it very difficult for Wyoming to achieve its target. The estimate of renewables would be somewhere around 9 million megawatts of wind energy that would have to be developed in order for us to meet our target. Right now, Wyoming consumes about 600,000 megawatts of wind energy. So that equates to about a 1,400 or 1,500% increase of renewables that Wyoming uses right now.
And you mentioned a lack of flexibility from the EPA in giving Wyoming what we would need in terms of to continue to produce a lot of the renewable sources. You mentioned that more than half of the land in Wyoming is federally owned, that this has a significant impact on meeting the mandates coming out of the EPA. Your reference to permits, to the NEPA process, to the ESA requirements, for which Wyoming has absolutely no control, and it doesn't seem the EPA is proposing any sort of relief in plans to address these. And I think you specifically cited that only 1/6 of the total area that the EPA has identified for wind energy development is actually available for wind energy development due to sage-grouse considerations, permitting requirements. It seems the EPA is telling people in Wyoming to move faster on renewable energy while refusing to acknowledge that Washington's foot is still on the regulatory brakes. So can you go in a little more detail about how federal land ownership in Wyoming and the red tape that goes with developing energy resources on that land is a Washington roadblock that the EPA ought to address if they want Wyoming to develop cleaner energy faster?
Yes, and what we've seen for wind energy projects where you have to go through the NEPA process, or those projects go through the NEPA process, that they've taken anywhere from 4 to 8 years to get approved through the NEPA process, and then there's an additional Fish and Wildlife Service process for eagle take permits. And those only will, those will add to the time involved. And the other piece of it is transmission. You have to have transmission to move the energy out of the state. Those right now, we have 2 projects that have taken up to 8 years to get through the permitting process, and they're still in that process now.
And we had previous discussions and debate and votes actually in the Energy Committee about transmission lines under the Democrat-controlled Senate in the past, and Democrats specifically voted to block transmission lines on the public lands, which half of the Wyoming land is public land. So that, I think, actually has played into exactly what you're talking about as well.
That is correct.
You also talked about the potential closure of 4 coal-fired power plants in Wyoming, over $1.4 billion, according to the Wyoming Public Service Commission. Well, that's lost investment, and who knows how much it will cost to replace the lost power. And of course, that's going to be passed on, I would assume, to citizens within the 6-state territory of Pacific Core, and Senator Whitehouse asked a specific question about Pacific Core. So would that mean that folks in not just Wyoming, but California, Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, and Utah are all going to get a big new energy tax increase because of what the EPA is trying to do in closing those 4 power plants in Wyoming and having to build new plants? Am I correct in characterizing what you're saying?
That is correct. Those costs would be distributed amongst all of the states involved with that system.
So California would have higher electric bills as a result of the EPA mandates here through that Pacific Corps.
Yeah, there's a portion of Northern California that's part of that system.
Okay. You know, a growing number of states are raising concerns that any type of implementation plan worked out with EPA is immediately going to become federally enforceable, making a state vulnerable to sue and settle lawsuits between environmental groups and the EPA. But unlike most sue and settle arrangements which deal with a single plant or single facility under EPA's power plant rule, a state's entire electricity system could become subject to environmental lawsuits. EPA actually agrees with this concern. During question and answering at an event in February, the EPA's acting air chief, Janet McCabe, said she sees potential for states being subject to third-party lawsuits if they submit state implementation plans. We've heard it from the Texas Public Utilities Commissioner as well. And I guess I'd like to, Mr. Chairman, if there's time, to ask a couple folks here, maybe the first three in the panel. If so, do you believe EPA can promise some sort of protection against these lawsuits? What are you seeing, Ms. Nowak?
We think the very foundation of this proposal already intrudes upon states' rights, and to have any state plans subjected to federal authority is a great concern of ours. I think setting state energy policy should be left up to the states and in conjunction with the Department of Energy, not set by the Environmental Protection Agency. So we have great concerns about losing any state authority over any of our existing laws.
Mr. Easterly?
We do not believe EPA can protect us from lawsuits under the Clean Air Act. They can happen, and they do.
Mr. Parfit?
Yeah, we don't believe that we could be protected from the lawsuits from third parties with a state plan as the proposal has been written.
Thanks. Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. Commissioner Easterly, when we had the acting air administrator, Ms. McCabe, here earlier in the year, I asked her some questions about the heat rate efficiency assumption for building block 1. And we know that EPA relied on the Sargent and Lundy analysis for that 6% heat rate. And in their own terms, they said that the EPA misapplied the data in a cumulative manner inconsistent with how the study was conducted. Do you have any other concerns with how the EPA developed that 6% heat rate assumption that's out there?
Yes, part of EPA's thought process for building block 1 assumed that you would operate the plants in a way that gained efficiency, which really means you have to operate them at a steady state output. But then we have building block 2, which says, but your coal plants are the last resort. You must operate your combined cycle natural gas plants first and use the coal plants to make up for swings in renewables and gas, and that will just make it much worse. There's also emission controls that you have to add on to the coal plants, which have good reasons to be there, but they all decrease the emissions or the efficiency of the plant because this rule is based on megawatt outputs, and there's a huge parasitic load for controlling those emissions. So there's a bunch of reasons that the plants are going to be less efficient on a per megawatt hour basis than more efficient.
So do you think that improvement is achievable in your state?
I think we're hoping, and hoping is a strong word, that we might be able to get 2% if everything was done that could be done. But it is a serious challenge because anything that's cost effective, you have a reason to do anyway if you're the utility because you make more money. So the things that are left will only be cost effective because the cost of not doing them under this plan is more expensive than the little incremental thing you'll get.
That's exactly right. And would compliance with other environmental regulations, would that have any impact on your state's ability to meet that 6%?
It will, because we still have some utilities that are going to have to add more energy for NOx and SO2 reductions that aren't there now. So that will decrease their efficiency as it's calculated under this rule.
You know, I support all of the above energy policy, and I know many of my colleagues on this panel also support that, all of the above, that we need to have a balance in our energy portfolios. I think that's extremely important for a number of reasons, security reasons, cost reasons. It's the wise thing to do. Do you think that this Clean Power Plan encourages diversity within our energy sector?
Not in the long run. In the long run, it basically is the plan to continue to shut down coal-fired power plants and have natural gas and renewables, and those are fine sources of energy, but if you've ever been in business, once you get close to a monopoly, you have pricing power, and that gas suddenly won't look like it does now in price. When I worked in the utility industry for a short period of time, we had a natural gas price spike, and it was very disruptive to all of our customers. And so I'm worried those are going to happen in the future.
And how does that, well, let me go to another panelist first, and then I'll ask another question. But Mr. Parfit, do you think that we're encouraging states and to look at a balanced portfolio when it comes to their energy needs with this plan that's before us now?
From our view, the answer would be no. It seems like the purpose is to go to redispatch of other types of energy sources to replace coal. And so it's not looking at a mix, it's really aimed at reducing coal.
You know, I'm from the only public power state in the country. In Nebraska, we rely on our public power. It's a strength for our state. It's a definite strength for our ratepayers. We're very concerned on the impact it's going to have on families across our state when and if this plan is implemented, because we rely on our coal-fired electric plants. We have diversified portfolios. We continue to develop those, but to have a requirement, a mandate to have those implemented, I think, in an unreasonably short period of time will affect families, and it will affect our most needy families. Mr. Parfit, how do you view that in Wyoming? You're our neighbors to the west. How do you view that? How are your families going to see what's coming to them?
We share the same concerns in terms of what the proposal will do to utility rates, particularly with our compliance pathway. As we see it, we would see an increase in rates due to the premature closure of coal plants and the stranded assets associated with that.
And Ms. Noack, in Wisconsin, I don't know what your energy portfolio looks like in your state, but I would have assumed that some of your ratepayers won't be pleased when they get their bills.
Not at all. You're correct, Senator. You know, our ratepayers have already invested over $11 billion since 2000 to clean up our air. That's continuing to be paid for. We've reduced emissions by 20% if you look at that 2005 as a baseline. So they've done that. We're not getting credit for it. We are a predominantly coal state. Like Indiana, we're a heavy manufacturing state. This will have a very large impact our modelers estimated between $3 and $13 billion just for generation alone. That doesn't include any natural gas infrastructure or transmission infrastructure that needs to be done. So that's going to hit every ratepayer from the low income to our large manufacturers.
Yeah. It'll hit every family in Wisconsin and across this country.
Correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Sessions, you were the first one here and the last to speak, it looks like. You're recognized.
Thank you. We had a little budget committee hearing that makes us all nervous. Mr. Easterly, I came here, I remember thinking that I don't like this idea that there needs to be a mix of sources of power. We just should have more nuclear power. That was my simple idea. But as I've been here and seen the arguments, I am of the belief that if you become too dependent on one source of power, you're not able to have the competition that keeps costs down. Do you believe that's still a valid concern?
Yes, and ironically, we don't have any nuclear, and I'd love to have some, but it's so hard to build it, as you know, that it's not likely to come in my lifetime.
Well, it's disappointing, I got to tell you. Natural gas rates have fallen, and cost of plants are up. The NRC is more regulatory than ever, and we're almost killing it off, which would be a disaster. I think the unifying issue that we can all agree on, Republicans and Democrats, is more healthy environment. Less particulates, less NOx, less mercury, less SOx, things that make people sick or kill trees and that kind of thing. I think we can do better about that. And in the course of that, I think we'll have a benefit on CO2 emissions probably at the same time. But I am not prepared to press down on the brow of my constituents billions and billions of dollars in cost over the CO2 issue, frankly. We just need to balance this out and be reasonable about it, in my opinion. So I believe you said, Ms. Nowak, that you believe that these regulations passed, cost of electricity will go up. Mr. Parfit, in your state, you think it would go up also?
Yes, that is correct.
And Mr. Easterly?
Oh, yes, we just aren't sure how much, but more than double digits.
And Ms. Nichols, do you believe that if these pass that you indicated, I'm not sure what you said, so do you believe it will go up or not?
You know, there's been a trend, I would say, over decades for the cost per unit of electricity to go up. But what we think is important is the bill, what the customer actually sees, and in that event, we're holding steady. We are able to hold that steady.
Even if these new rules are passed?
I believe so, yes.
Mr. Myers, what's your view about that?
Yes, Senator, I would concur with Ms. Nichols that it's been our experience that you can reduce carbon emissions and also keep electricity prices down.
Well, now, Ms. Now, you indicated that we spent a lot of money. You've spent a lot of money to make coal cleaner than it's ever been before. And if those plants are closed, are you saying those are the stranded costs, the lost investments that are damaging to the ratepayers in your state?
Correct. The costs that our modeling estimated would cost is for new generation only. It doesn't take into account paying for units that have been recently built, and our power plants are paid for over many, many years. And so ratepayers will be paying for these plants that are run much less, while at the same time paying for new electricity. So yes.
And Mr. Easterly, I'd ask you to see if you can say yes or no on that too. But let me ask a simple question. It seems to me that mandates, regulations that drive up cost are in an economic sense, are the same as raising taxes and having the government do it. In other words, the government could raise taxes on everybody and then pay for cleaning up power plants or whatever they want to do to achieve a certain goal. So I just want to translate this into reality for the people who are buying electricity, businesses and homeowners and people like that. So these mandates that require greater expenditures to produce electricity are the equivalent of a tax on their lifestyle. Isn't that correct?
Yes, it is, but different people benefit and don't benefit. So if you're in a regulated utility that makes a profit, if your price goes up and your percent of profits is the same, that goes up. If you're an REMC, a co-op, that your customers are your owners and they really see it, and there is no net benefit there.
Well, I think that's the question. Is the tax on the economy worth the benefit that is achieved? Now, Dr. Lundborg here from the Copenhagen Institute said that the increase in CO2 over the next 60 years is not going to be a detriment to the world. In fact, would be a net benefit And he will agree that if this continues out into the next 100, 150 years, you begin to have a cost. And so he questions some of the expenditures we're talking about today. And I just believe that's a fundamental thing. He talked about how many lives could be saved for just a fraction of these costs, helping poor people in a lot of different ways. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this hearing and the good witnesses we've had.
Thank you, Senator Session. Senator Boxer wanted to have just a moment for a unanimous consent request and enter something in the record, and so we'll just recognize you for 30 seconds to do that, and then me for 30 seconds, and then it's over. All right?
It's never over. Okay, so Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to place into the record a very important chart that shows that Californians are paying $20 less per month for electricity than the national average as we reduce carbon pollution in such a great way. And I'm so grateful to Mary Nichols for playing a role in this.
Without objection, so ordered. In my 30 seconds, two documents, one from the Census Bureau that says California has the highest U.S. poverty rate when comparing income and cost of living across the state. And secondly, from the Manhattan Institute, that migration from California to Oklahoma increased by 274% in the 2000s. Without objection, so ordered.
You're lucky.
And we are adjourned.
You're lucky to get us.
Thank you.